probably heard it said that the end justifies the means. This means that the actions that people take are justified regardless of how they go about achieving their end or desired end result. Many attribute this to a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. At the beginning of the 16th century, he published a book, a small book at that, called The Prince, where he outlines a political theory when it comes to strong leaders. And he argues in that book that strong leaders can be benevolent, but at the same time harsh and cruel towards their enemies, and that they can employ whatever means that they want in order to maintain their hold of their power, at the same time in order to ensure glory and honor for the state or for the country. And later on, this particular political theory is applied to psychology. And when we refer to somebody who has a Machiavellian complex, is one who is deceptive, one who is able to manipulate people, and devious at times. But Machiavellianism, or this, the end justify the means type of attitude, is not only unique to strong leaders or tyrants and that, but it is something that is very common in our society as well. And you've probably heard people express things like, it's hard to get ahead without cutting corners here and there, or say something like, the best way to handle people is to tell them what they want to hear, or somebody saying, never tell anyone the real reason you did something unless it is useful to do so. And you may probably try to excuse yourself and say, I've never been like that. Well, how about the time when you only focus on your own ambition and your own interests? How about those instances when you prioritize money and power over relationships? Or perhaps when you attempted to exploit or manipulate others just so you could get ahead? Or perhaps those instances when you lied and deceived somebody because you feel or you thought it is required of you? Or perhaps those instances when you use flattery just so to gain favor? Or perhaps those instances in the past when you rarely revealed your true intention towards another? Now, embracing the end justify the means attitude becomes all the more tempting when we find ourselves in a tight spot. Especially, for example, when we attempt to get through a crisis, or when we are desiring to see an easy solution to a problem, or when we are desperate about overcoming a difficult challenge, or perhaps when we are fearful that a catastrophe might happen. We give in to the belief that the end justify the means. As we shall see in this episode in the life of Abraham, that such an attitude betrays a lack of faith in a faithful God. Faced with a real threat to his life and family, Abram took matters in his own hands by employing deceptive means to ensure his safety in a foreign land. In contrast to his display of obedient faith that we saw at the beginning of this chapter, here we find him capitulating into unfaithfulness. Or somebody said he wandered into unfaithfulness. And as we reflect on this story, I would like for us to hear this very simple and yet relevant appeal to all of us today. That we are to keep trusting God to fulfill His promise or promises even in the worst of all circumstances. That we are to keep trusting God to fulfill His promises even in the worst of all circumstances. We sometimes think that God is only capable of doing certain things for us and on our behalf at a certain level, or when things are not as complicated as we think they are, we set some kind of a parameter or a limit as to how God can intervene and get involved in our life. And when things are really bad, like really bad, we feel like God may not be capable anymore of doing what He said He would do in our life or fulfill the promises that He has given to us. But we are to keep trusting, even in the worst of all circumstances. So we saw last time that Abraham traveled from north to south of the promised land of Canaan. We don't know how long he stayed there up to this point, but we are told that suddenly there was a change in the situation in Canaan. This was supposed to be the place that God said He would give to Abraham and to his descendants. This is supposed to be where he's going to settle. And yet we find at the beginning of verse 10 that something happened in the land. It says here, now there was a famine in the land. It's not unusual for a place like Canaan to have problems with agriculture. We know that it's a hilly country and it's very difficult to cultivate or plant grains in areas like that. You would have to be creative in terms of creating some kind of an irrigation system. And during that period, they're not that sophisticated yet. Although in some places like Egypt, they already mastered the art of irrigating the land. But because of the geography or topography of the area, at times they would have problems with planting and harvesting crops, so that there will be periods during the year, or at times longer than a year, where it would be difficult to get the regular rain, or there would not be enough rain to water the crops that they have planted for that time. As a result, there will be periodic famines in the area. And in the case of Abraham, I'm sure he's thinking now, this is where God has called me. This is the place where He said I would settle and I would live. And yet, here I am faced with this difficult circumstance. So it says there was famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. Verse 10 really is some kind of a summary, a statement. So he is already in the promised land and is supposed to be claiming that land, and God said that's where he should be. And now he encounters this big problem. They ran out of food. And if you run out of food, you want to go where food is available. We can presume that Abraham at this point might have heard already of a place called Egypt. He probably heard how the Nile River provides enough irrigation for the Nile plains, where the abundant harvest is almost always sure every year. He probably has heard about the storage of grains in Egypt and how foreigners from other countries have ventured south in order to get their share of food in a time like a famine. So there was famine in the land. If we were to look back to what Abraham did, we would probably think that, he acted in obedient faith at the beginning when God said, live. And now the issue is, there is famine. Should he stay or go? Some people say that this is probably a sign that the faith of Abraham hasn't matured yet. He's just starting to follow God. It's very possible that at this point he probably said to himself, oh well, I was really excited at first when God said He's going to bring me to this land, and then here you go. Then I would have to move on. So that's why it says Abraham went down, because we know that Egypt is south of the promised land, to live there for a while. So let's just say that there is no intention to settle there, but this is a temporary journey in order to secure food for himself and for his family. So he's not really deciding to live there for good, but he's just going to go there to get grain and bread, perhaps. But there's also another level that we need to see what's going on here. Remember, he acted in faith when God said, live. So now there is a change in the circumstances. The situation has been altered. There is a factor of famine. The next question that we need to ask is, what is Abram going to do in light of what he has been promised? There is a threat to his own life at this point. And he knows very well, if they die of famine, then the promise would come to nothing. He knows very well that, if they don't survive in the land, what's the point of promising the land to themselves? It just doesn't make any sense. They won't be alive to enjoy whatever it is that God said He would give to them if they would die in that land. I don't know. You probably want to ask, was it just common sense? Maybe, we were out of food. Let's go buy food somewhere else. But we're just going to come back because this is our homeland. Or was it a test of faith? It's a difficult test indeed. God said, go to that place. That's the place where I want you to be. But the famine made it impossible for Abram and his family to continue to stay in the land. Of course, the question that needs to be raised is, will he trust God enough to provide for him despite of the famine in that land? It's easy for us to analyze this and be, this is from 4,000 years ago, and say something like, oh, yeah, I will probably stay and God will provide and all that. Well, we would see that later on that God provided manna, God provided for Elijah, and things like that. Is it impossible? Of course not. God can provide. But what probably frustrates us as a reader is we saw Abraham first trusting God when he was asked to leave to go to a place that he did not know. That was a tough decision. But this is a lot tougher, I should say, because now, if they stay, they would probably die, I don't know, or maybe God will provide miraculously for what they need. And yet it seems that Abram in the story has already decided that he would go down to Egypt. So he said, I'm going to go down to Egypt. There's food there. How can we tell that he was in fact decided in his mind already that he would go down to Egypt? Because we see that in the narrative itself, there is a pre-event contemplation. We are given an insight as to what Abram was thinking prior to the event itself. That is why we read in verse 11, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And then when the Egyptians would see you, they will say, this is his wife, then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. One thing that you would see right away is that faith, in fact, is counterintuitive. At times, it may apparently sound nonsensical. Because faith would involve absolute dependence on God. Faith would involve absolute reliance on God. If Abram were to exercise his faith in the midst of the famine, he would probably stay and depend on God fully, but at the same time, he may end up risking his life and the life of his family. But we will never know, because he did not stay, right? And in fact, isn't that exactly the choice that we are faced with? Every time our faith is tested, are we going to act despite contrary evidence? Are we going to continue to do what God says He would do, or what God is requiring of us? Are we going to persist with what is right, despite everything else that we are seeing in our surrounding or in our situation? But we all know that the default human strategy to life's problems is always self-preservation and self-direction. So instead of praying, like most of us, we resort to devising. Instead of trusting God, we turn to scheming. Instead of maintaining faith, we revert to striving for ourselves. So in the face of famine, Abram looked to Egypt and turned his eyes away from the God who promised to bless him. Now, it may sound to be a sensible decision given the circumstances, and we would probably applaud him for being wise and commonsensical in his approach to life. But we need to factor in the fact that God has already promised him or promised blessing to him. And in removing himself from the promised land, he is in effect jeopardizing the fulfillment of the plan itself. Although, the promise itself, although if he stays and dies, it's still going to be a problem. So you could imagine the dilemma of Abram here. But nonetheless, he acted just like everyone else would do in such a situation. Interestingly, we would probably expect him to be described here as one who would come before God when there was famine in the land and say, God, would you please provide for my needs? Or when it was told that the crops can no longer be harvested, we would expect that he would say, God, would you please bring rain to the land? But instead, he said, no food, let's go to Egypt. I don't know what it was like for you when you first heard that there's going to be a lockdown. Many of us run into the groceries, and engage in a wrestling match with a few others who are trying to buy as many sardines. Right? We want to resort immediately to our means and resources and figure out for ourselves that maybe I can remedy the situation and get through this particular crisis. For Abram, I'll go to Egypt. But there's a snag to his plan. We are told that he contemplated on the possible scenario of how things are going to be when he gets into a foreign land. He immediately remembers how having a beautiful wife can become a problem for him. Now, at this point, Abram is 75 years old, and Sarai is about 65 years old. So a looker at 65. She's very beautiful. Tradition tells us that indeed she was beautiful, and some would argue how could a 65-year-old be beautiful, without the benefit of modern science. Yes, they were beautiful and they lived longer back then. There's really no point in trying to say that she could not be a stunner at that particular age, given what we know of that time and period. So the snag to his plan is you have a beautiful wife, and it could be deadly during that time to have a beautiful wife with you. As he has anticipated, if they see that I am married to this beautiful wife, he was thinking that it is some kind of a practice among Egyptians to just simply take whatever they want. But he's not being unreasonable here. We all know, even today and in ancient times, that foreigners can easily be abused and taken advantage of. So he's thinking that, if I go there, people would see that my wife is beautiful. They might forcibly take her away from him. And to get rid of the witness and evidence, they'll probably end up killing him. Let's just say that he doesn't have a lot of, probably have not heard a lot of good reports about the Egyptians and women and their likes or preference for Mesopotamian beauties of that. So he said to himself, okay, the solution to the famine is to go to Egypt, but there's one complication. If I go there, I might not be able to fulfill what I've set out to do because of my beautiful wife. Now, by the way, I'm tempted to make a joke about marriage, but this is a negative example story for marriage. Okay? This is not the place where you go to and say, oh, let me learn about what marriage is like. It's quite the opposite. So, left to his own devices, Abram said to himself, what am I going to do with this beautiful wife of mine? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. To save my own skin, he didn't say that, but we see that was the outcome. I'm going to pass off Sarah as my sister. Now, you can be technical on this and say that, oh yeah, we know from other passages that Sarah is in fact the sister of Abraham. They share the same dad and different mothers. Now, of course, we're talking about probably the time when they were still pagan, and we didn't have what we see, for example, in the Mosaic law, where this type of marriages are prohibited already. But at this point, we know that that is the case, and for Abraham to pass off Sarah as his sister would probably be some kind of a half-truth. So he's affirming one thing, but in the process of affirming that he is his sister, he is in fact denying or suppressing the fact that she is also his wife. So he said, okay, that seems to be a good idea. And we also know in the Mesopotamian family practices that when a family loses their parents already, the older brother is usually the one who's given charge over the younger siblings and even sisters at that. So that's what he's thinking here. So when people would hear, the Egyptians would see that she is his sister, and he is the older brother in charge of this younger sister, then he will be treated well. In fact, he anticipates that this will provide him some kind of a leverage if ever a bargaining comes up or a marriage proposal is brought on the table. So the idea is, when we go there, I'm the brother, you're the sister, and then if somebody says, oh, pretty, can I marry her? And then probably, let's just speculate a little bit here, probably what he's going to try to do is try to raise the, the dowry or whatever payment is needed to get a bride, to the point that they will be unable to actually pursue Sarai, at the same time eventually preventing them, from getting her as a wife. This was really a cool plan, I should say, because one, he's going to save himself. At the same time, it would appear like he is offering Sarah to the Egyptians, but really, he's going to ensure, by being the person in charge over her, that nothing would happen in terms of marriage proposals. Right? So that was the plan. So he went on. We are told that when they came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. This type of description is rarely used in the scripture, but extremely beautiful. A stunner, like a Miss Universe type of woman. So all these Egyptians who hasn't probably traveled outside of Egypt and sees this Mesopotamian beauty, and they were just floored. In fact, we know that she became a talk of the town because Pharaoh's official, we'll just call them the scouts for Pharaoh's brides. So they saw this foreigner, beautiful at that, and they probably said to themselves, that's somebody that's the Pharaoh is worth having for a wife. Let's go back to the plan of Abraham. Abraham's thinking was, the Egyptians would see her and probably offer marriage. But he's only thinking of ordinary Egyptians. There was one individual that he forgot. He did not factor into his plan. Did you see that? Because when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh and she was taken into his palace. The whole plan backfired. He wanted to save himself, save his wife, and he probably thought that he could get away with simply pretending to be the brother of Sarai. But then he forgot about the most powerful man in Egypt. I'm thinking he probably underestimated the beauty of Sarah. He probably thought, she's awesome, she's beautiful at that, but I don't think she's really a queen material of some sort. But that's precisely what the Egyptians saw in her. So they recommended, or the officials of the court brought her to be Pharaoh's wife. But the Pharaoh is not someone that you would bargain with. Abram cannot walk into the courts and says, the imperial courts or the royal courts, and says, Pharaoh, I need to speak with you about this woman you took yesterday. Can we have some kind of arrangement? No. The Pharaoh gets what the Pharaoh wants. She was taken to be the wife of Pharaoh. The question that I want to ask Abram is, so what now? What's going to happen to the promise that you're going to have plenty of children with this woman? Not with any other woman, but with this woman. And what have you done to your wife? She's going to be one of the wives of Pharaoh. At this point, we're thinking, boy, what's going to happen to the promise of God? With the woman who's supposed to be part of the plan being stuck in the harem of Pharaoh. Thanks to the dutiful husband, Abram. As I have said, this is not a positive story for marriage. It's a negative example when it comes to marriage. This is not how you should treat your wife. They're not chips for bargaining. Neither are they your means to achieve whatever it is that you want to get in life. But that seems to be what happened here. He lied, and that plan backfired. He got more than what he bargained for. Now there is no hope at all for him to ever get his wife back. But some of you would probably say, oh, it's okay, look at what it's getting in return. You give away your wife, so this is what you get. The Pharaoh said, he was treated well. The Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake in verse 16. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Donkeys and camels are notable here because they are used for transportation. And they're very expensive during that time. Only the wealthy, the kings have donkeys and camels. They're the preferred transportation means for the royalties. So to be given these animals as gifts, we're seeing the generosity of the Pharaoh and perhaps also the value that he saw in Sarah. The Pharaoh is probably thinking, man, this is jackpot. Look, I'm going to have to reward the brother here. Thanks for coming over to Egypt. I didn't have to look for you. So Abram becomes wealthy through his deception, but risk Sarah in the process. So we see here that Abram's attempt to do things his way and to try to wiggle himself out of a tight spot, his desperate attempt to overcome this challenge, resulted to more harm than help. Not only to himself, not only to his family, but to the promises that God, or to the promise that God made to him. Now, of course, there's plenty of things in life that can easily put us in the same boat as Abraham. Some of us, when faced with severe financial difficulties, it's very tempting to act like Abraham and to engage and even allow for underhanded means just so we could get by. When there is a threat of physical harm to our family or to the health of our family, it's very tempting to be deceptive about it. It's very tempting to try to go around or work the system just so our family is protected. When there is the risk of academic failure or even professional failure, we struggle with maybe, doing this and that may be okay. It's not really lying. It's not really padding my resume. It's just making me look better just so I could get or have a better chance at getting a job or getting a grade or completing a course. Sometimes when we are in the middle of a relational conflict, it's very tempting to simply, engage in a full-blown war and just insist that we come out on the top of everything. That we are the winner and not the loser. It's very tempting to engage in all kinds of things that we ourselves are aware to be contrary to the will of God. But we argue though and say, because my security, my family's security, my well-being is jeopardized, therefore I am allowed, therefore I can be, that I am justified to engage in this particular means. Look at what happened to Abraham, or Abram. Traded his wife, practically, for wealth that I'm sure he could not enjoy anymore at this point. Or if he really loves his wife, I don't think cattle and camels and donkeys can be a substitute for her. If we end the story right here, it's pretty much call it a tragedy. That's it. We started really strong and we were cheering for Abram. He was like, go man. God said go, and he left. Kept moving until he got to the promised land. And here he is, because of a famine, went to Egypt, lied about his wife, and got his wife in trouble by becoming part of Pharaoh's harem. But he got wealthy. But look at what God is doing all along. One thing that you need to appreciate about Bible stories is that the way characterization is done of these lead characters or individuals is that they give you warts and all. They don't sanitize the person. Right? Abraham is an exemplar of faith, and yet we are given an insight into his own weakness. In fact, an instance where his faith failed. But look at what God is doing in verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. If there was one person who would not allow for the promise to go down the drain, it was God himself. He promised this to Abraham. He's not going to allow for the foolishness of Abraham to destroy everything. So Abram may have been faithless, But God remained faithful all throughout. He intervened in a timely manner in this case, and inflicted disease on, I would say, poor Pharaoh. He didn't know what he was getting into. He got sick, and in ancient times they always attribute this to the workings of the gods. I don't know, maybe God personally revealed to him. I don't know what happened, but we know that they got so sick at his household and immediately realizes that this has something to do with that new wife of his, Sarah. That's why the text says, because of Abram's wife, Sarah. Here's another thing that you would notice in this story is that the pagan characters, in this case the Pharaoh, from whom we're not really expecting much because they're pagans and they're Egyptians, they're not worshippers of Yahweh. They would do the exact opposite of what Abram did. Okay, listen to how he's going to complain about the trickery that took place. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her to be my wife. Pharaoh is like, what I don't know if he used expletives here, but he's visibly upset. I mean, just looking at between the lines. He's like, what have you done? The initial plan of Abram is, his presumption about Egyptians is that when they see my wife, they would just take him away, take her away. But then Pharaoh is like, dude, we don't do that kind of thing here. Why didn't you tell me that he was your wife? I would dare not touch her if she was your wife. But all along, Abram is thinking, oh, they're going to take my wife, and I'm going to make sure and all that. And then the Pharaoh is like, you fooled me. I have plenty of wives, I think that seems to be the implication, but I would never, ever take somebody else's wife. It appears that the Pharaoh has a better sense of what morality and marital integrity is all about. He's the guy who's saying, dude, this is not something that you do. We don't do it here in Egypt. I don't know where you came from, but we don't do that kind of thing. And that is why we're getting punished for being fooled into doing it. And then because of God's intervention, I think, the Pharaoh said, now then, here, take your wife, take her and go. Just go. I don't need that explanation. Just go away. And this is how they treat people who can be the curse of a community, or somebody that brought a bad luck or something like that. Just go away. Go away. And verse 20, the Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. In fact, when you go to chapter 13, it says, Abram, because of that, became very wealthy. Thanks to Sarah. Immediately we notice in the actions of Abraham is that when you become fearful, your faith dies out. When you start to look at things with your human perspective, or looking at things really without God in the picture, you become unsettled in terms of how to go about. Faith is supposed to ward off fear. Faith is supposed to keep fear at bay at all times. But when you allow for fear to kick in, faith goes out the window. And when we become fearful of our own life situation, it appears that we always fall back. We revert to our own folly. We become wise unto ourselves. And we fall back to our ungodly way of thinking and doing things. And it is really fear that causes us to make or to take matters into our own hands and ignore God's involvement in our life. So when Abraham got to Egypt and everything happened as he has imagined, but he was so surprised that it was the Pharaoh who would put a complication to his plan. And instead of seeing our hero fade away in the process, we see his great and faithful God intervene on his behalf. That intervention is really an expression of his commitment and faithfulness to the promise. If he did not make a covenant or a promise with Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12, God could have simply allowed for the natural course of things to go on and allow Abram to suffer the consequence of his actions. We see all the more now that God's initiative of promising to Abram is being reinforced now. He's being made to see that if there's someone who's going to bring everything to fulfillment, it will be the one who made the promise. And in fact, in general, this is a display of God's grace in the life of Abraham. Something that we ourselves experience regularly. We could count the many instances in our life when we became faithless and fearful, and when we ignored and abandoned God, when we turned to our own ways, and yet we continue to receive the blessings, the provision, the protection. I'm sure you can think of many, many times in your life that despite of what you have done, despite of what you have failed to do, you see God's grace continue to flow in your life. Which makes us see and realize every time that it's not really our own doing. If we are to be the basis by which God would treat us in terms of our righteousness and our sinfulness, it would probably not turn out to be very good at all. Would you agree? If we are to be treated on the basis of what we have done in this short life that we have been given, I'm sure that for all of us, the end result is what Paul already said. Everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. But the fact that God continues to treat you in the manner that He does today, loving you, caring for you, looking after you, that's His grace that you are experiencing. Because He is faithful to His people, He would do this over and over again. Now, you will find yourself, as I've said, in a similar tight spot as Abraham did, and you will try and probably be tempted to resort to your own devices. But this story wants us to understand that God is asking us to just keep on trusting Him. We should keep on believing Him. Do you mean I need to keep on trusting that God will provide even though, we only have one meal a day in the last 3 days? Do you mean that even after I've been laid off from work that I would continue to trust that God will provide a source of income for me? Do you mean that even after the doctors have already given up that I will continue to trust that God can provide and will provide healing for my loved one? Well, you should. You can keep on trusting this God, because He will be able to fulfill what He has promised, even in the worst of all circumstances. Now, if you are in such a desperate situation today, I would like for you to keep on believing, to keep on trusting this God. You don't have to lie your way out of that situation. You don't have to craft some deceptive strategy in order to avoid the negative consequences. You don't have to bend the truth just so to get the advantage that you are seeking. You don't have to resort to simple ways of doing things. You can keep on trusting God. just have to keep on believing this God. And as we continue in the story of Abraham, you will see that in those many episodes that will be mentioned in his life, we'll see this God acting consistently, always making sure that the promise is protected and eventually fulfilled. This is what God does to his people, and this is what he would do in your life and in my life. There is no guarantee at all that, I don't want to promise you, or neither the Bible promises that each one of us somehow, would have a smooth sailing life. Right? And that things will get better from now on and all that. We know that that's not the case. But I can tell you though, that our situation or circumstances may be changing, but we have this God that we can keep on trusting. Regardless, let everything change. Let the world turn upside down. But as long as you are trusting in this God, you can trust the God who will fulfill his promises, even in the worst of all circumstances.
Amen.
Would you please join me in standing as we end our time this morning? We pray for you, and then we'll sing our final song, just declaring that, one thing remains, that he is God who will be faithful to each one of us. Our Heavenly Father, we can be Abraham, or we have been like Abraham so many times, God, in our life. We have been faithless. We have been fearful. And at times, God, we resort to our own devices and just try to do whatever it is that we can, ignoring the things that you want for us, and ignoring the fact that you can be our source of help, our source of comfort, and our source of strength. Father, forgive us for those times when we thought we could make it, when we mistakenly assumed that we can fix our problems, when we became overconfident, God, about our ability to deal with our situations. I pray, Father, that even this morning, starting this morning for all of us, that we would see, Father, our limitations, that we would realize, God, that our own resources, our own powers are nothing. And help us to see that it is by your grace, it is through the empowerment of your Spirit, God, that we are able to deal with whatever situation that we are faced with today. And those of us who are just who are right now caught in a very tight spot, God, who are just crying out to you for help, I pray, Father, that you would just prove yourself to them, as you did with Abraham in Egypt, that you can intervene on their behalf, God, in the manner that you see fit, at the time that you see to be, that you know to be right. I pray, Father, that each one of us would have that encounter with you, that we would see with our own eyes, God, that indeed you make good whatever it is that you promised to us. And Father, as we continue with these changes that we are faced with every day, the good and the bad, would you enable us to maintain our trust in you, to keep on believing, to keep on holding on to your promises, to keep on depending, God, on your word, to keep on looking to you as the source of help, to keep on trusting at your work in our life. Help us to just keep on keeping on, God.